Scientists went digging for the story of ancient childhood and they found it. Tiny skeletons. Thousands of them, in burial ground after burial ground, on every continent people ever settled. Infants who never made it to their first birthday, laid in the ground beside the adults who buried them. And for decades, archaeologists looked at those little graves and drew the obvious conclusion that the ancient world was a meat grinder for babies. That having a child back then was closer to a coin flip than a beginning. Then someone actually checked the math. And it turned out those thousands of tiny skeletons might not be telling us what everyone assumed they were telling us. Not even close. So how many ancient babies really died? Seriously, sit with that for a second, because it sounds like the easiest question in archaeology, and it might be one of the hardest. This goes back further than farming, further than writing, further than cities, kings, calendars, or a single word ever set down in stone. Before any of that existed, people were being born and people were being buried, and the ratio between those two things shaped absolutely everything about how humans lived. And the evidence here is stranger than you'd expect, because the deeper researchers dig into it, the more the number moves. There are really two questions tangled together here. The first is the surface one. What percentage of ancient babies died? The second is the far more interesting one. How would we even know? And the answer to that second question is going to change how you read every documentary you've ever watched about the ancient world. Before you can count how many babies died, you need something almost nobody thinks about. You need the bodies. Not most of them. All of them, or at least a fair sample of them, buried the same way adults were, preserved the same way adults were, and found the same way adults were. That's a bigger ask than it sounds. Picture the world these people lived in. No cemeteries with rows and records, no registry office. A group of maybe 30 people moving across a landscape, following animals and water, burying their dead wherever they happened to be standing when the death happened. An infant's skeleton is small, thin, and soft. The bones haven't finished mineralizing. Put one in acidic soil and give it a few centuries and there's simply nothing left to find. An adult femur can survive 50,000 years. A newborn's rib cage might not survive 50. So already, before a single calculation, the record is broken. And then something changed, because researchers stopped treating the bones as the answer and started treating them as the problem. Start with the number you've probably heard. In 2013, Anthony Volk and Jeremy Atkinson published an analysis in the journal Evolution and Human Behavior, pulling together data on infant and child death across human societies, including 17 different hunter-gatherer groups. Their figure for babies dying in the first year of life came out around 27%. Around half of all children died before reaching adulthood. Now, most people hear ancient and mentally round every grim statistic up to nearly everything. It's the opposite of what the evidence says. Roughly 1 in 4 in the first year is catastrophic by modern standards. Modern global infant mortality sits under 3%, but it is not 90%, not remotely. Why does the bigger number feel true then? Because of a second statistic that gets misread constantly. You've heard that ancient people only live to about 25 or 30. That's an average, and averages lie when the data is lumpy. If half your sample dies before puberty and the other half lives into their 60s, the mathematical middle is a number that describes almost nobody. Nobody was dropping dead of old age at 25. Either you died very young, or you had a decent shot at gray hair. Read that again, because it quietly rewrites the caveman in your head. But here's where it gets strange. Those percentages come mostly from skeletons, and skeletons are exactly the thing that just failed our test. Look at what happens when you examine real sites. Paleodemographers studying burials in the Nazca Valley on the southern coast of Peru and at Sila de Poros on the Spanish island of Mallorca in the Iron Age kept landing near the same grim figure, somewhere around half of children not surviving to adulthood. Different continents, different millennia, different everything. Same answer. Which sounds like powerful confirmation. It isn't necessarily, and that's the trap. Because organic material rots in centuries while stone lasts forever, and the same logic applies inside a grave. What survives isn't a random sample of what died, it's a sample of what happened to be buried in the right soil at the right depth, in a culture that buried infants the way it buried adults, Plenty of societies didn't. Some placed infants under house floors, some in separate grounds, some in ways that leave no archaeological trace at all. The absence of proof isn't proof of absence, but the presence of proof isn't proof of proportion either. That's not a detail. That's the whole foundation, wobbling. And in 2021, a researcher at the Australian National University pushed the wobbling foundation over. Her name is Claire McFadden from the ANU School of Archaeology and Anthropology, and she went at the problem sideways. Instead of digging up more ancient bones, she took modern data, infant mortality, fertility, and infant death counts from 97 countries in the United Nations database, and asked a simple question. If you only had the graves, what would they actually tell you? The answer was not what archaeology had assumed for the better part of a century. The number of dead infants in a population tracked the birth rate far more closely than it tracked the death rate. Think about that for a second. It's arithmetic, and it's brutal in its obviousness once you see it. A society where women have 8 children each will bury more babies than a society where women have 2, even if a baby in the first society is safer. More births, more deaths, same rate. So, when an archaeologist opens a burial ground and finds it thick with infants, the honest reading isn't, these people were dying constantly. It's, these people were being born constantly. You're telling me a graveyard full of babies might be evidence of a thriving population? Yes. Yes, it might. McFadden's own summary was blunt. Burial samples show no proof that a lot of babies were dying, but they do tell us a lot of babies were being born. She found no support for the long-standing assumption that around 40% of prehistoric infants died in year 1. Not that it was definitely lower. That the graves simply never said it in the first place. And the implication she cared about most had nothing to do with statistics. It was about the mothers. We spent a long time picturing our ancestors as archaic, overwhelmed, barely coping, people who lost children constantly because they didn't know any better. If the birth rates were high, the more reasonable inference is that those women were competent, that they were keeping children alive well enough to keep having them. Let's be honest about something, though. None of this means ancient childhood was safe. It absolutely wasn't. Take yourself there for a moment. You're a parent in a group of 30, somewhere cold, and your infant has had a fever for 2 days. There's no thermometer, no clinic, no antibiotic, no way to know whether this is a passing thing or the end. You can't Google the symptoms. You can't drive anywhere. There is no anywhere. What you have is water, warmth, other people's hands, and time. And the honest fact is that a bacterial infection we'd now clear in 5 days with a course of amoxicillin was, for essentially all of human history, a genuine coin toss. Now multiply that by every childhood illness that exists. That's the real story, not a 90% death rate. A world with no floor under you when things went wrong, and the stakes ran the other way too. A group that couldn't keep its children alive didn't just grieve, it vanished. Isolated families died out. Connected groups survived. Every human alive today descends from an unbroken chain of parents who managed, somehow, to get at least one child to breeding age. Every single link held. That's not a sentimental line, it's a logical necessity. There's one last layer, and I saved it for the end, because it's the strangest part of all of this. Ask why the 90% version feels so believable, and you land somewhere uncomfortable. It's not that we have evidence for it. It's that we want the past to be that bad. Because a monstrous past makes the present feel earned. It flatters us. It turns ancient parents into a backdrop we're standing on top of. And the actual evidence keeps refusing to cooperate. The graves, that looked like proof of catastrophe, turned out to be proof of fertility. The lifespan of 25 turned out to be an artifact of arithmetic. The 40% figure turned out to be an assumption that had been repeated so many times it stopped needing a source. Here's the thing, asking what percentage died might be the wrong question entirely, because what the evidence actually documents is not a death rate, it's a birth rate. We went looking for how ancient humans died, and the bones answered a completely different question, how relentlessly they lived. So what's the real answer? Somewhere around a quarter of infants in the first year and roughly half of all children before adulthood, in the best forager data we have, with wide variation between groups, and with a serious argument from McFadden that even those numbers rest on graves that can't carry the weight. Not 90%, not close, but high enough that the shape of every human life was built around it. They had more children. They spaced them and nursed them for years. They raised them in groups, not households, the aunts, the grandmothers, the whole band. And they buried the ones they lost carefully enough that we can still find them, 40,000 years later, which is its own kind of answer about how much they cared. The larger truth is this. The number was never the story. The response to the number was. So those thousands of tiny skeletons, the ones that convinced generations of archaeologists that ancient childhood was a slaughter, they were saying something else the entire time. They were saying these people kept going. They kept trying. They kept filling the world back up, over and over, through the worst odds any parent has ever faced, all the way down the chain to you. That's not a graveyard. That's a lineage.